Hi everyone, and good morning. Welcome to this webinar. So I'm actually our leadership series. Today we'll be talking about how to make adaptability a habit. So my name is Luc Lemarois, and I'm a marketing manager here at Headspring. So this webinar is intended to be interactive. Actually, we want to hear from you. So please do send in your comments, your questions by using the question box. So it's actually on your right-hand side. It's in the application. So yes, please do send in your questions, your comments. We'll be having Bevan here to go through the questions and creating the discussion in this webinar. So as I said, today we're joined with Bevan, who is our head of digital content. Bevan, hi, how are you, man? Glad you could join us today.
Morning, Louis. Hi, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, good. Yeah, fantastic. I'm really excited about this actually, and perhaps it's my pleasure to introduce the real hero of the morning. We're joined today by Adam Kingl, who's an author, educator, management consultant, widely sought for his expertise on the future of business. And Adam, it's a real pleasure to have you on the webinar this morning. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So Adam, perhaps just to lay a bit of context, I'm really looking forward to your exploration of this topic today, especially in the context of how habits connects to adaptability. I think this is a really key message to get out into the world at the moment. But just to kind of zoom out a little bit, I mean, we hear the word adaptability a lot these days, especially over the last few months. And there's almost a concern in my mind that its meaning and its value is perhaps a bit diluted just from overuse and just being exposed to this term too often. Yet this is still one of the most crucial personal and professional skills we can learn and employ at the moment in these particular times that we live in. Why is that, in your opinion? Why is adaptability so specifically important and relevant to where we are today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, adaptability, I think, is overused. Because of the context we're in right now, where everyone has obviously seen that we have to talk about it. But two is it's used a lot because it has lots of different meanings. So right in our context, clearly we see that as leaders, we have to keep our people engaged and focused, but that requires leading them differently, particularly for those of us who can't see our people face to face based on our industry or function. But even before COVID-19, we knew that there was literature appearing saying that leadership is contextual, so it depends on each relationship, and that requires very adaptable leaders. And it's also what our youngest employees require. So when I was researching my book, Next Generation Leadership, and that's what it looks like, ta-da, what was discovered was that our youngest employees need us to be authentic, not just to us, but for them. And that requires huge flexibility in terms of how we lead. But let's talk about organizational adaptability. Isn't it funny right now, both today and pre-COVID-19, our incumbent companies, the dominant companies in our industries, seem to be terrified by these small, nimble startup/disruptors. It seems that scale and experience doesn't matter anymore, that it's a lot less about resources and a lot more about resourcefulness. And so, so I think that adaptability is one of, if not the most important qualities that we require of ourselves individually, as well as collectively in our organizations.
Yeah, fantastic synopsis. Thank you, Adam. I mean, that's a really great observation. How adaptability has actually been, to a large degree, perhaps overlooked in some ways in terms of its interpretation. But as an organization, this is, I love that comment about resources versus resourcefulness, which is really at the core of this topic, isn't it?
Yeah, no, precisely. So, and I think it's very much on all of our minds, right now, because not only are we struggling to think about how do I manage, how do I lead, how do I just lead myself, right? How do I kind of get through this and maintain my career? But for our organizations are really wondering what their future is going to look like. I'm sure a lot of companies have been in the middle of lots of pivots right now in terms of identifying new customers or serving their customers in new ways. So it's been extremely challenging, no doubt about it. And I think, look, here's maybe the reality of it. Love this, but for sure, we live today in a world where the future is less and less an extrapolation of the past, right? We live in a world that seems to lack equilibrium, where change is relentless, is shocking, is seditious, and there's no way of insulating it, no way of avoiding it yourself. And in that maelstrom, long-held beliefs, political dynasties, 100-year-old institutions, venerable institutions are finding themselves possibly less relevant or irrelevant. And the question is, how do you think about leading and managing in this world where the future is not so far in the future anymore? I was thinking here, you think about the number of things that are changing, not just related to COVID, but all these things that are changing at an exponential pace around the world. And I think we're actually in a unique time when the number of things that are changing at an exponential pace is not flattening out, it's picking up pace. And by the way, these little bars here, that kind of growth curve is also for medical knowledge too, which doubles every 72 days. So if I'm an optimist, that certainly gives me some hope that we will see our way through to the end of our current crisis. I mean, many people talk about this, right? Word VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think this has been done to death. I would just simply say that the world's a whole lot more VUCA than it used to be. So the delta of VUCA is getting higher by the day. And you see this in all kinds of ways. Think about the volatility of the price of a barrel of crude oil, for example. Not too many days ago, it was negative. So people would pay you to take their oil off of them. I mean, whoever would have predicted that we would have seen such a thing, let alone the context that we're in right now. So let me just take a moment. What's driving all this? Because I'm going to argue we're about the first generation in history, and it depends where you draw the line, that has to deal with this steadily accelerating pace of change and number of things that are changing, the threatened irrelevance of every institution, of us as individuals. I'm sure many of you are aware of the statistic that there are many jobs that we, our children and grandchildren will have that don't even exist right now. So there's been an inflection point for sure in the pace of change, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. The winds of change are blowing at gale force. So, there have been wars, revolutions as far back as you can go, but the number of things that are changing at this pace, I think, is new. And so here's the question I want to ask. The most important question for any of us is, are we changing as fast as the world around us? And I think for a lot of us, the answer to this question is no. No, we're not changing as fast as the world around us. In fact, for virtually all of us, that answer is no. Yet we're constantly surrounded by these dislocations, these discontinuities, these perturbations. And let me just give you a little bit more data. So this is some research that we did when I was an associate of the Management Lab, a research institution. We took the world's 50 largest companies going back these different time frames. And this x-axis is a measure of the standard deviation of year-on-year volatility in revenue growth rates. So the same would be true for profits. So what we're seeing is more and more volatility year to year in profitability. What that says basically is today's profits are a poorer and poorer predictor of tomorrow's profits. In fact, there's a 30% probability that any company in the top 20% of its industry, in the top quintile, will lose that ranking in the next few years. So it all comes back to the simple conclusion. The world is becoming more turbulent faster than we are becoming more resilient and adaptable. So here's a question for you. And here I really want fastest fingers first. You all have a question box where you can participate, and I would love your participation. So just type away throughout this, throughout our conversation. Bevan is going to be curating your questions and comments, and we'll pause at certain times and have a discussion. But here's a question I want to ask you right now. What does it take to prompt deep change? Whether you can answer that personally, on an individual basis, or collectively on an organizational level. What does it usually take for people to challenge their fundamental assumptions about whether it's how they hit their KPIs, who their customer is, how to better serve them, how do they respond to shifts in their environment, like what we're dealing with right now? What usually has to happen for us to make a fairly substantial change? So you go ahead and just,
Yeah, I mean, just to bounce off that, Adam. Yeah, I mean, in the chat box, anyone listening to this, please, just 1 or 2 words. What does it take for you personally, or as an organization and organizations you've been, to prompt deep change? What is it that catalyzes deep change, or is required for it to get going?
And it's funny, we're all getting used to being more comfortable with chat boxes. And I was doing a webinar the other day with a single organization, and something that I learned is how much more flexible we are, how much more adaptable we are in terms of our communication, right? So it used to be just like things like if you had a yes/no question, people would either answer yes or no. Then they would answer thumbs up or thumbs down. But now this company, they were using so many different emojis, all just to mean yes. So when they would just said yes, would be like dancing penguin, dancing monkey, a chick coming out of an egg. It's like, but all these things just meant yes.
Well, it's one way to ensure positive responses, right?
Yeah, exactly. So let's see.
So we got a few general responses, Adam. I mean, some, but basically around the question of need, there has to be a primary need, some kind of driver to prompt that kind of deep change. I mean, from your point of view, what is the overriding driver of change in this scenario?
Yeah, well,
these type of scenarios, I guess.
We're living it right now. I think, for us, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but for us really to fundamentally adapt, it generally takes a crisis. But that generally means it's too late. It's reactive instead of proactive. But when you read books on change, you see they're just one of 2 stories on change. It's either a small incremental adaptation, but no crisis. Like I shifted from PC to Mac, or I decided to go into this adjacent market with my product or whatever. A lovely little story of change at the margin, but not very fundamental. Or 2, almost all the stories of deep change are stories of crisis. Is that how it should be? I don't know. I think the only advantage of gray hair is you start to see the patterns, and you start to have a better sense of when people are maybe deluding themselves. So I remember a decade ago, people in the UK told I've lived here for over 20 years, but about 10, 15 years ago, people would tell me, if you look at retail in the UK, Tesco is the best managed retailer in the world. For those of you who don't know, right, Tesco is a grocery retailer, largest grocery retailer in the UK. And their CEO at that time, Sir Terry Leahy, is a god who can do no wrong. And in 2010, fascinating statistic, Tesco collected 1/8 of all the retail pounds in the UK. So what do I know? Well, I know this. Sooner or later, this is likely to happen, right? Because if you miss some critical change, you fall off a cliff. Someone once said, every manager is successful until they're not. The trick is knowing when you're not on the success track anymore. And if you look at our organization, deep change is almost always belated. It's frequently convulsive, and it's very expensive. So it's kind of ironic that in some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world, change sometimes happens in the way it might feel in a poorly governed country. just think about that, and maybe for some of the same reasons. So actually, let's go to another question for the question box. If I ask you, let's take the term adaptable. So the word, just everyone reflect for a moment on the word adaptable. When I say that word, or if you hear someone tell you be adaptable, or your manager says you need to be more adaptable, or we as a team or a department need to be more, what is the feeling that you have? If someone says we need to be more adaptable, just a one-word answer, please. What
so
feeling?
Adam, if I could just interrupt there, just on a technical point. Yeah. There's a bit of a we have some answers coming through chat, some coming through the question box, and just to reiterate what Adam said when answering this question and also the future questions, I think let's use the questions facility to all those on the call. So Adam, if you just want to repeat your question, just so we can.
Yeah, absolutely. In a one-word answer, what's the first feeling that you get? Just so don't think too hard about it, right? This is a gut answer. What's the feeling you get when you hear the term adaptable? Or if someone urges you to be more adaptable, you need to be more adaptable, we need to be more adaptable. Just please give us your answer in one word. So how do we feel about adaptability? Because that's the topic, right? If we're saying how do we make adaptability a habit, I think we first have to confront, well, how do we feel about it?
So we've got some answers coming here, Adam. So adaptable, let's go. It's a very strong proactive move. Fear, obligation, we will see, You know, that's very
wait and see. Yeah.
common and understandable, cautious approach. We'll see. Let's see how this works out. Fear again. So that's a strong response, obviously. Some feel supported, others feel challenged immediately. Others tap into feeling flexible, nervous, challenged. So, I mean, there is some are able to accept it and really step into it. So it sounds like we have quite a multitude of perspectives. But I mean, I suppose the strongest trend coming through here is we're linked to that sense of nervousness, anxiety, fear.
Right. Yeah.
Some see opportunity and purpose, which is extremely positive.
That's extremely positive. That's fantastic. And and it does. So even if there's a large percent, whether it's half, 40%, 60%, 70% that have a negative feeling toward adaptability, I think that goes a long way toward demonstrating why adaptability is hard for us, right? In essence, to make it really as simple as possible, we don't want to do things that make us feel bad, that scares us. So because our attitude toward adaptability, or that a critical mass of people in our organization have this attitude toward adaptability, that makes it tricky. And I'm not judging anyone, right? It is natural. I understand where it comes from, but that's part of the obstacle right there, right? So we have to dig deep and figure out how and why we can turn adaptability into an opportunity, into a positive. Because I would argue that human beings actually are pretty adaptable, but our organizations, not so much for this reason. But having said that, the first part of that is not necessarily conventional wisdom. So when I ask, leaders, what would it take for change to happen in your organization? Often they'll say, well, that's the problem. People are against change. So, I think that's perhaps more true when we are in work life than when we're in personal life. And let me just demonstrate this point. We'll see, right? We have a lot of data points in the room. I think we have 76 attendees. So let's see if we can draw some conclusions from 78 data points. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and we're going to have a poll that's going to come up on your screen momentarily. Don't answer that poll yet. I'm going to list a few things. Just listen. And what I'm going to ask you is to answer, are any of these things true for you? So just hang on for a second. You'll have a chance to vote. Just yes, no. So just think about the last 3 years of your life. Okay, here's some questions. So just think about, are any of these things true in the last 3 years of your life? So you've changed house, you moved houses, or you've moved into a new home, or you've moved to a new city. You've changed jobs, either inside your company or maybe taken a whole new role in a different company. You've lost 10 pounds, 5 kilos, 1 stone, whatever. Gaining doesn't count here, okay? Just to be clear, but losing counts. You took a course voluntarily, so you wanted to learn something new. You took up a new hobby, something you haven't done before. You went on holiday to a place you've never been before, or you made the switch from PC to Mac, okay? Or you have a new partner, spouse, whatever that might be for you. Over the last 3 years, are any of those things true for you? Yes or no? Is that poll up? And could you just answer yes or no? So there you see it's under polls. Just answer yes, yay or nay. Were any of those things I listed true for you? So far we're batting 100%, saying yes, right? And we're at 10%, 13%. So okay, now we're starting to get some no answers. But look at that difference, right? It's almost 9-1, yes over no, right? So here's the point. We're not really against change, right? As human beings, we're resilient, and you might think, well, we have to make change safe for people, right? We have to de-risk it. Well, I'm not even sure about that, right? Again, if we can find opportunity and positivity within riskiness, then we can actually do things with joy. So here's a question I'll ask you just to check. So let's go to the question box. So let's see, we're at 90-1, yes to no. Go to the question box and just answer, just one word answer, thumbs up or yes. I just want to see how many people in this room that we're having together who rides a motorcycle. Could you just see if you happen to ride a motorcycle, could you just do yes or a thumbs up or a tick or something? I just want to see how many of you there are in the question box. Do we have anyone who drives a motorcycle?
I mean, while we wait for the answers, do you ride a motorcycle, Adam? Out of interest?
You know, I don't, but it's not that I have anything against. I don't have a driving license in this country. I had one in the U.S. You can hear from my accent for 20 years, and then I moved
Sure.
here, and this whole left side of the road thing is definitely a challenge in adaptability.
It takes a while, a couple of decades.
Takes,
we've got quite a few yeses actually, Adam.
okay, brilliant. Okay, so brilliant. My next question is for everyone who has said yes, you drive a motorcycle, okay? So if you ride a motorcycle, so whether you use that back in the day when you commuted into work, remember those halcyon days, or whenever you use it, okay? Whenever you use the motorcycle and however you use it, is that the safest way to travel? Just yes, no. Those you motorcycle owners out there, is that the safest way for you to get across town, to commute? Just yes or no.
I think we bit of silence on the line, Adam.
And I'm not meaning to I'm not naming or shaming anyone, right?
Well, I mean, from one of the motorcyclists, we've heard no, not the safest. Another also agrees, no, it's not necessarily the safest.
Okay. So again, one word answer. So why do you do it?
Not.
Definitely not. Okay. So why do you do it? One or two word answer. Why? So it's not the safest thing for you to do, yet you own a motorcycle, you use the motorcycle. Why do you ride a motorcycle when there's so many other ways that are innumerably safer? Why do you do this to yourself? What's the just one word answer, two word answer, just incomplete sentences welcomed. Why would you do that? Why would you do that to yourself? Why?
Well, I mean, I can answer from personal experience, Adam.
Yeah.
I mean, I was never, a very serious motorcyclist, but it was something I dabbled with in my student days. And
yeah.
We've got one answer is passion.
Yeah.
Joy. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
I might take it up again. It's convenient. I mean, I remember it being a lot of fun. It was and freedom and independence.
Yeah.
I mean, these are good things. Pleasure.
So here's something that's actually dangerous, at least compared to other options. And yet, why do we do it? Look at the words we use: fun, exhilarating, free, thrilling, right? So, we scuba dive, we ski, we rock climb, we do things that maybe aren't always the safest. I don't know. Do you have to make change safe, or do you have to make it fun, exciting, adventure, upside, something new? So that all means I think we are willing to do different things, difficult things, if there's the right incentive. And often that has to do with us as leaders about how we contextualize it, and how we allow people to practice that personal adaptability on an ongoing basis, not only the time when it's absolutely required because it's a burning platform. So here's the question. Here's our exam question. For personal adaptability, how can you build an evolutionary advantage in yourself? Not a competitive advantage at a point of time, but how do you forever outrun change? Right? Be relentlessly optimistic, constantly looking forward, never taking refuge in denial, adapting before you have to. How can you build an evolutionary advantage? Let me give you an analogy of what I mean by that. If you go to the gym, pick up some weights, you go on the treadmill, you start to exercise, what happens to your heart rate? It goes up, right? You have to think about it. You have to go, come on, heart, let's go. Come on. No, you don't have to do anything. It just happens. Given whatever level of fitness you have, it happens automatically. Or think about what happens when you see someone who is attractive to you. Your pupils dilate reflexively, whoosh, just like that. Can't be helped, right? So be sure to tell your spouse or partner that. Can't be helped, right? And that's reflexive, right? It's unconscious, whoosh. Doesn't, for women or men, same response. So if you think about these things, it's automatic, it's spontaneous, it's reflexive. Is that the way we talk about change in our work lives? These are not the words that we use. In other words, change in our work lives can feel like this long military campaign. It's like a march. It's difficult. But can we make change start to feel like an autonomic system, either organizationally or personally? That would be an advantage. Okay, so that's one question I want us to think a little bit about as we proceed through this session, because we have to, in this new normal that we're in, change is fluid, not episodic. It's not convulsive, it's continuous. That's why it has to become a habit, and one that you don't even have to think very hard about. It's part of your fabric. It's part of, the whoop and wharf of your weave. And so when we think about ourselves as leaders or managers, or personally as professionals, is our professional life about building in more control, or is it about building in more relevance? And that's part of what makes adaptability a habit, is if we have that mindset. Well, how do we start to do that, right? We have to have some focus, some lens through which we can start to practice this as a habit. I need something to hold on to, some example that I can start to practice. And this isn't new, right? This method of how do you turn something into a habit and make it ingrown in yourself comes, all the way back to Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. Said to find a habit, you have to just start doing it until eventually it becomes part of you. So how do we practice adaptability? How do we make it easier? Well, okay, I'm going to introduce some adaptability principles. There are a lot of them. I'm going to give you three. So how do you practice personal adaptability and agility in different ways through different lenses? You may want to jot these down as we go and think about how this might help you in your own adaptability challenge, whatever that might be, that requires a more agile approach. So the first principle is experimentation. So what is an experimentation in a business context? Just this: a low resource trial that tests a hypothesis, the goal of which is to uncover and share learning. Because surely, generally, when we have to change, well, we have to know, what do I have to change to? That's often the issue, right? Particularly as leaders, if we tell people that they have to change, they might say, well, okay, fine, but what exactly do you want? Give me some clarity here, right? Change from what to what? So I'll come back to this, what this means. But for any of you who were science majors, you know that all I'm asking is that you apply the scientific method to your business context, right? So take a low resource trial, an experiment group, and do something, compare it to a control group. That gives you data. That's can be very useful, whether that, again, personally or collectively. So if you think about, here's a contention. There's nothing more resilient and innovative on our planet than life. Despite meteor strikes, volcanic eruptions, extreme climate shifts, wandering tectonic plates, and pandemics, life is not only persistent, it has flourished. And in that process, it's become ever more complex and adaptable. This despite the fact there's no standard evolutionary model, no CEO of life, no overseeing agency, no strategic plan. Yet in our work life, and despite the stakes, most of us are hostile to relentless across the board experimentation, right? Because that's how life is, constantly experimenting through sexual reproduction and selection. Well, one of the reasons is that there's this fear that we have of mistakes. The inevitable consequence of experimentation is failure. Trial and error involves, well, error. Yeah. It clashes with the drive toward operational perfection built into most organizations. Moreover, I would say if something goes wrong, the instinct is to affix blame. It must be somebody's fault, so the thinking goes. So no wonder people choose to play it safe. But as with life, breakthroughs are often the products of screw-ups, fumbles, misdirection. Think about evolution again. Every mutation is an error. But without them, there'd be no progress. But let me just give you a caveat here. Look, I'm not saying every idea deserves to be tested. Some ideas really are stupid, but most of us need to be testing a lot more than we are. I mean, I think the pace at which any of us can evolve is limited by the pace and breadth of our own experimentation. So we have to redraw the line between sensible and silly. But we have to be a whole lot faster in testing. You can be virtually error and mistake free, or you can be highly adaptable. You can't be both, because perfection is the enemy of progress. So if you think about grocery retail again, according to Nielsen, the market research firm, only 20% of new product launches are on the shelf 2 years later. That suggests an 80% failure rate, 80% resources wasted. But I would argue if those organizations did a lot more low-cost experiments, that could change, right? You wouldn't have all these heavily funded national rollouts that are failures. The culprit is a lack of experimentation, both before and after launch. So we need to make a lot more small bets and a lot fewer big bets. So how do we construct an experiment? Just as you would in a lab, here it is. So take, for example, the Chinese confectionery Hsu Fu Chi. They were family founded and owned until they were bought by Nestle a few years ago. But the way that they try new products or new packaging on existing products is they just take a store, just a single store, right? And they introduce the new packaging or the new product. And then a week later, they look at what the sales were for that product or new packaging, right? So very low cost, very low effort, but they're learning all the time. So they're always launching new products, but they're doing it on such a small level, it costs them next to nothing. They just have one dedicated room in their factory, which is very adaptable, right? So for creating new packaging or products quickly. So again, it's about nimbleness versus scale for them. So in other words, my goal is I hope that all of you will start to try to adapt to experimentation, certainly several of a year, but you don't blow up what's already there, right? You don't blow up existing processes. You try to do something that you can do within your envelope of permissions, where the risk is going to be bounded. Okay, next principle is openness. So openness enables to co-create the future. So it's a little easier because, when we can see more of it. So how do we do that? How do we embrace an external perspective? Because we have to overcome all these baked in assumptions. So I think one of the other problems is when we talk about adaptability, organizations discuss adaptability very internally in a team meeting, right? In a town hall. They don't talk to customers, suppliers, regulators, etc. So that's the classic and toxic cocktail of not invented here, NIH, and of course, controlism. In the conventional innovation and adaptability model, we invent and develop all on our own instead of widen our aperture of the world. And that was the sort of mindset that was at work at Procter & Gamble when Larry Houston took over as the head of R&D about a dozen years ago. So the company took tremendous pride in its research bench at that time, and that included some 7,500 of the world's most brilliant scientists and researchers. And Houston realized that even this incredible collection of geniuses represented just a tiny fraction of the scientific intelligence that existed outside of P&G. And he hit upon Joy's law, which is the maxim of Sun Microsystems co-founder Bill Joy. And it's this: no matter who you are, the smartest people work for someone else. So by Houston's calculations, there were at least 1.5 million people in the world whose expertise and passions were relevant to P&G's vast assortment of brands. So for Houston, the answer was to adopt this pioneering effort called Connect and Develop. So that's C&D as distinct from R&D. The goal was for P&G to double the impact of its development efforts by sourcing half of the company's new technologies and product ideas from outside. So Houston recruited a cohort of internal scientists and engineers to serve as technology entrepreneurs. So these people were idea scouts. They scoured the world for relevant innovations. And that yielded 100 new products in the first year alone, thus turbocharging P&D's traditional R&D and adaptability engine. So, there's always been a surplus of creativity in the world, deep veins of latent innovation, untapped and unused. But now we live in a world with cheap and instant communication. All that potential can now be mined. And that is the ultimate flip from not invented here to could be invented anywhere. Okay, last principle is Slack. So what do I mean by Slack? Think about Google's 20% time that they give some of their employees to pursue a passion project. And of course, that created Gmail, Google Maps, etc. Or 3M, where giving their people 20% time resulted in the Post-it note. Or take W.L. Gore, who give their people passion time, and that allowed one engineer to create guitar strings, which are the best-selling, most durable guitar strings in the world, by applying the material that they put on bicycle cables to guitar strings, just to see what would happen. But here's my point: if we don't give ourselves time to experiment, to look outside, to adapt, we won't do it, right? So we find ourselves governed by a tyranny of the day-to-day, where we never devote time to adaptability. So it should not be a surprise to us that we say we're not adaptable. So how about holding for yourself a FedEx day? So nothing to do with FedEx per se, but based on the FedEx promise that you'll have it the next day. So, Google gives their people 1 day a week to pursue a passion project. You may not be able to afford to do that either organizationally or individually, but it's an interesting idea. But maybe you can do 1 day a month. Maybe you can do a couple days a year. But it really, I think you have to ask yourself this question: is it valuable to give people more discretion over their time? I think right now we're doing that by necessity because we're in lockdown. So it's happening already, and people are hopefully practicing that personal adaptability using the slack that they find that they now have. Consider running for yourself a 24-hour hackathon. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about a feature, a product, a process that you want to toy with. Give yourself 1 day to do it, to try it, to build a little prototype. Share it with your colleagues, maybe even some external parties, suppliers, customers. Brainstorm a bit, then develop the idea. Maybe pitch your idea to some peers to get some feedback. But this whole thing is literally 24 hours, overnight. And you might get some amazing ideas. You might get some very, very practical ideas, but you could make quick progress. You don't have to go to the Google model, right, and run this every week. But I tell you, I think most of us don't think ever about running a little hack for ourselves in 24 hours. Or what about getting some of your staff together on a call, like what we're doing right now, and work on something for 24 hours, right, to design a pilot or whatever. But most of us, we create this big project, and it takes months, and we only get 90% done at best. And that's just not the way I think we should be devoting ourselves to this. So I said there were a bunch of principles, but I wanted to give you 3 adaptability principles to make it specific. So in talking about adaptability and how do we make adaptability a habit, first we said, well, you have to have a good attitude toward it, right? You have to sort of shift your mindset toward what we think about when we hear adaptability, because human beings actually are adaptable. 2 is you need clarity, right? So what does it mean to be adaptable? How do I make it a habit? You have to practice it. So I'm giving you 3 different lenses through which you can practice personal adaptability: experimentation, openness, slack. By the way, those things are not mutually exclusive. You can do any combination of them. But I wanted to give you something very, very practical to get started. But you may have questions or comments. And let's just pause, Bevan, to see if anyone has questions, or indeed, if anyone would say, yes, we've done this, or I've done this. Here's what I found to be so, because some of you may be adaptability geniuses out there.
So, I mean, a lot to think about and respond to there, Adam, and to just echo that to the audience. Please submit. This is a great time to submit questions for Adam around those 3 principles, but also your experience of adaptability and how what Adam's been speaking about really feels to you. Is this within a ballpark of something that is applicable, or even something you can action in your own life, or is this something that just feels out of reach? Is there anything that you need extra clarity on? There's a question, Adam, that I think is a really great question. You were speaking earlier about experimentation, and
Yep.
The question here is about the rate of experimentation. So, I mean, you had a really beautiful connection to evolution, and you're speaking about nature and how natural ecosystems. And I think the point of this question is around that evolution happens at a certain rate, and it's usually quite slow. One of the things that people react to in the current environment is that the expectation, there's so much pace of expectation. Things have to change so quickly. We have to respond so quickly. How do you know that you're experimenting at the right rate for your organization, for yourself, or for your market?
This is a very meta answer. You'll experiment your way to the answer, right? In other words, you'll ramp up or down your volume of experimentation until you find, I think what you have to get to is an equilibrium whereby your rate of experimentation is higher than the rate of change that you're experiencing. Until you reach that equilibrium, you are not experimenting enough, right? Then either you personally or your team or your organization is not adapting as fast as the world around you.
Yeah, okay, fantastic, thank you. We've got another, someone shared a personal experience, and this is around, I think, that sense of experimentation, moving into this quickly and with an open mindset. Someone shared a story about making the manufacturing without paper was a great achievement in their plant. There's a question here as well. How would you all practice this in an organization that is lean on resources? And I think this, there are a lot of small startups, small organizations that really have a lot of potential in the current environment. So how, I mean, what's your first thought on that, Adam?
Well, first of all, I would say that just about everything that I've mentioned can be or is free, either money. Certainly, there is an investment of time, but you can be very controlled in that as well. So, for example, running a little personal experiment for yourself, right, to gain knowledge, doesn't have to cost anything. Again, if we think of an experiment as this huge project rollout, yeah, absolutely, that's going to be expensive, and I would argue that's not the way to go, right? That's going to restrict the volume and acceptance of experimentation as a cultural norm. Openness, right? Opening your aperture to the world to be more, have more conversations with people outside your organization costs nothing other than your time. And then again, and this comes back to Slack, right? That you have to create the time and you have to be thoughtful about that, right? It may vary from week to week, but it certainly has to be greater than 0. And that's the problem. Right now, the amount of Slack that we're creating for ourselves to be adaptable, to experiment, etc., is 0. So, whether that's 5% a week or 20%, that is a question. But if you find yourself having to go to your boss or the organization saying, I need X thousand pounds to do something, and it's about adaptability, that's probably not the right approach, right? Because you know that 99% of the time the answer is going to be no, and therefore your adaptability just goes to nothing. So you also have to be adaptable about how you approach adaptability, and say it's got to be quick and dirty, cheap to free. And you have to, what also helpful is to employ like-minded activists, and that's the next point that I'm gonna come to, right? You have to start to socialize it with your people so that they can help you, give you their resources, whether it's their feedback, their time, things like assets, a few minutes on a machine, or whatever that might be. Because I fully admit, right, that we all have constraints. That's never, going to change. But it's not about having ultimate freedom and no accountability. There are constraints, but it matters a lot how those constraints are built, right? I mean, if I put you in a straitjacket and I cinch up that straitjacket, you'll panic. It's a terrible feeling. You don't want that. But if somebody loves you, who puts their arms around you, physically, that actually may be a similar sensation, but it's a totally different emotional reaction. So where the control comes from and where you set the boundaries for yourself or for your people is the question. So ideally, it's around shared values, shared aspirations, accountability to your peers, transparency, advocacy, helping one another. But there's always going to be a box. But it matters hugely how it's built. But, as I said before, try to make the process social. Talk to a lot of people in a lot of different layers of the company, not just your peers. And and maybe just start with, I want to be more adaptable. So for you, what do you think that means? What do you think I have to do? What gets in my way of being more adaptable? What's your idea of how I might change this? Or as a team, how might we be more adaptable? Could we run a little experiment that tests that idea and then run with it, which is within your power, but then socialize what happens, because that learning, right, is terribly important as well. If you discover something not to do, you don't want other people to waste time trying the same experiment. So in other words, this is not some new variety of change management with a huge rollout. We're going to do something that's much more like a roll up. It's much more socially constructed. So if you go to a little website for you to look at, managementexchange.com. This is the Evolution of Management Lab, the research institute that I was a part of. There are a lot of tips there about how to make that happen. But here's an interesting little tidbit. We asked 1,700 HR directors, what do you think gets in the way of adaptability, right? So how would you know that adaptability is going to be tricky? We just gave them a couple weeks and we collated all these answers, and they actually all fell under just a dozen themes. These are the enemies of adaptability. We tagged them all, we organized it, put order to the chaos. But look at this, right? And I think for all of us, we look at this list and we say, well, this is really intuitive. And I was pretty much blown away by this because I think about this stuff a lot. Here's 1,700 people. You give them a question, a little bit of direction. They came back with essentially the list that I would have given. So great, this is useful to think about because organizationally, so if we expand our scope to organizationally, it helps then to know what's getting in our way. And then we can start to run experiments, have open conversations, create some slack in order to start to hack some of these things. And it can happen regardless of the size or constraints in your organization. I am absolutely convinced of that, and I will prove my point by just giving you a little story. So if we think about what is the most complex, biggest organization in the UK, most of us would come to the conclusion it's the NHS, right? The National Health Service, particularly right now, right? An organization that really is stretching its resources, that it's pushing its boundaries of adaptability. I think they have almost 1.5 million employees. And here are two women who impressed the hell out of me, Jackie Linton and Helen Bevan. So they were mid-level within the NHS, not junior, and they actually worked in the change management department of the NHS. They were maybe 3-4 levels from the CEO, maybe more, and they were frustrated with the fact that every change initiative at the NHS took forever, somehow got suborned. And as you know, NHS is in the papers every week, right? Rightfully so. Sometimes it has to do with victories, which is wonderful. Sometimes it's about a new problem. But these two love the NHS and they devoted their whole lives to it. They're actually, quite experienced change managers. And in January of 2013, that was the 65th anniversary of the NHS. And Jackie and Helen had been talking to some young trainee doctors. So they'd only been in the NHS for a few months, maybe a year, and they were already completely demoralized. And these women said, well, let's try to drive change in a different way. With these young doctors, they created something called the NHS Day of Change. And you can Google this or you can find it on managementexchange.com. They got a little social platform together, a collaborative platform. And they didn't get permissions, right? They didn't say, anything other than it's a day of change. Can we do this? Is this okay? They just launch it. And they asked people, do you have an idea about how you can improve patient care in the NHS that will make you feel better about doing what you do and doing it with us? Make this little pledge on this little form online to improve patient care. So they launched this in 2013. They thought that their department, the change management department, might be made redundant. So they knew they might possibly have only had 3 months to do this. So they gave themselves 3 months. They were hoping for about 65,000 pledges. They got 189,000 pledges. And then they did it the next year and they got 800,000 pledges. This method spread to 9 other countries, national health services, and Jackie and Helen would go on to form an online school called the School for Health and Care Radicals, where they teach people how to launch grassroots change programs in their companies. But this is what two people can do when they don't feel helpless, when they don't assume change is someone else's job, when they don't assume I have to get permission to adapt and to try something new. So I'm ending with this idea. If you want to make a difference, you want to know how to make a difference, you want to know how to be adaptable, think like an activist, right? Think about building a coalition, using social media, opening a conversation, starting a grassroots movement. Because what happens is this: when you start asking these questions and you start connecting with people, very little can stand in your way. Yeah, it's not a coup, right? It's it's people who love their organization and want to make a difference. But it's understanding that if you're waiting for that to happen top down, it's not going to happen. So you can read more about this, online. But I tell you, it's so impressive to me because people talk about, how to be more successful at adaptability. Well, yeah, you have to be uber motivated, but you have to learn from our vanguards. And here's, 2 people who taught us just do it, to quote Nike, think like an activist. Don't try everything top down, just get on with it within the boundaries that you have. And they did that in, again, the most complex, heavily regulated organization that exists in this country. But I want to ask you now what your thoughts are in terms of these 3 lenses, perhaps, that we've talked about. Can we put a little poll up, actually? Let's just see what's resonating with you. We'll ask you, which of these, experimentation, openness, slack, you see that on the right-hand side of your screen, perhaps under polls, which one might you try, say in the next month? Are you already thinking about trying one of these things. Now, your answer too might be, well, I'm going to try a couple of them, right? I'm sort of doing a mashup. That's fine. But which one really either resonated with you? You thought you'd really want to give that a shot. Then what I'd urge you is right after this webinar is sit down and jot that down, right? And then socialize it, because we also know from psychology that if I share a commitment with a colleague or a friend or a family member, I'm much more likely to remain committed to it. Of course, also the benefit you get, the payback you get is feedback from that person, and possibly even, in fact, probably more often than not, a pledge for help, right? How can I help you? Which is, again, how activism happens. So whether you think about you're an activist for yourself, in your own adaptability, or for your organization or team or department or country, this is how it begins on this day. But just be brave. And where have we got to? I think 46% are going to try experimentation, 39% openness, 14% Slack. That's interesting. I hope that means that you probably know already that you can create a little bit of time to either run an experimentation or have some conversations or run some thoughts or initiatives with people outside your immediate sphere. But there's quite a good wide distribution there, and that's good. I think that's the way it should be. And ideally, too, if you want to make adaptability a bigger capability within your own organization, try to make sure that people are being adaptable in different ways at different times, right? Not just everyone doing experimentation, that some people are applying different lenses. I don't know, Bevan, what are your thoughts on that, or questions that maybe you or other people have on this?
So I mean, I agree with you. I think that spread of the principles that people are going to try after this webinar is quite interesting. Slack, I see ranks lowest, and I agree with you. I hope that's because viewers of this webinar are already in that place of giving themselves time. But I think also, when a lot of questions, actually one of the questions that came up earlier was around how do you choose to use your resources, especially if you've got very limited resources, when we're in a time of crisis. And the time of crisis, obviously happens at various levels. There's, the social or the economic sense of crisis at very high levels, but for a lot of people, this comes down to themselves personally, and everything else might start looking better, but they might still start feeling even those passages of crisis. And obviously one of the rarest resources we have is time. So, in a way, I read that statistic as possibly that people still feel that difficulty in giving themselves time, or they feel within the organization that they might not have the permission to take that time. I mean, what's your view on that, Adam? When people are still in that sense of, we just got to get through this right now, how do you balance that with giving yourself that slack, that space? You don't feel it's really available to you.
Well, you really do. I think you even said it yourself. You have to give yourself permission, right? I think many of us are still burdened with this Puritan guilt that if I'm not buckling down and just doing my job to the letter, it's somehow not worthwhile effort. And that is unfortunately a widespread cultural norm, right? That spans industries. Ironically, it's even in creative industries, right? That was my first industry. I worked in the creative arts. And actually there isn't enough adaptability in that industry either, because people really just kind of focus on a given project or production or whatever that might be. So I think it's so certainly if any of you are in a position, and I'm sure many of you are, as you're a leader, right? If people report to you, you've got to role model this ability of giving people permission to practice their own personal or team adaptability, right? You have to start the conversation. You have to show that you're doing it yourself. Surely none of us can be, as role models. We can't say "do as I say, not as I do." And actually, right now is the best time to do it, because people are reflecting on either what they do, how they do it, their careers, their team, their organization. It's actually, the door is cracking open for you to encourage people to do this, rather than buckle down and just do this KPI.
And I mean, to your point, the leaders who I've seen doing this the best create sort of a container for their team, for their organization that almost kind of protects them to a certain degree from the pressures, the external pressures, and allows them to have that kind of psychological safety to experiment, etc. I mean, there's another question here, which is, in a way related to this, which is, what do you do in very risk-averse industries such as the financial industry? And you shared that great story about the NHS. I'm assuming that the solution here is really about that. Do what you can, and stay persistent to make those incremental changes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like the NHS is probably the most heavily regulated organization in the country. I have done experimentation hackathons with one of the largest banks in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And as I say, you do it within the boundaries of what you can legally do. But also, if you're starting to talk about, about regulation, you might be thinking too big first, right? Think about something that is within your purview, your department, you yourself, right? If you're starting to think about these huge kind of game-changing like experiments that will require change in regulation, you probably aren't starting in the right place. These things, as I say, roll up rather than cascade top down. 99% of the cascading top down huge change management projects probably don't work particularly well. But when things gather momentum, they just start here with this individual or this team or this office, and they kind of grow and grow and grow. It's actually easier then to start to get other parties to come on board with what you're doing, including regulators.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. And just one final question, which I think is a great question to finish off on anyway. The question here is, the trust in leadership also plays a critical role, doesn't it?
Yes, totally. Yeah. So leaders have to you have to be really clear that I'm going to do this too. That's first. Second, you have permission to fail, right? Every failure is a learning. So I don't just want you to, to fail, but share with us, right? What did you learn? There's still learning in a result that you would say didn't prove your hypothesis, or you had you used the paradigm of openness. You had a conversation with someone else and that didn't go well. Okay, well then that's not the person to have the conversation with. Try someone else, right? And third is, I think for leaders, you've got to be brave. It's that positive approach to it, but also show people, right, that we have moments where we can demonstrate courage. And I think as human beings, we respond to clarion calls for courage much more than clarion calls for caution. And I think actually right now, people actually are probably craving within the boundaries of health and safety. So I'm not going there. People want that ability of their people saying, be brave, for their leaders. And you can make just as much of a difference to our team or our department or our organization, as the CEO, but it just requires you to take that step.
Adam, thank you so much. Really fantastic points and a really wonderful place to finish. Thank you. And just to confirm for everyone on the webinar, Adam has very generously offered to share his presentation with everyone. So is that something that we'll send to everyone that's on the call the week?
No, so if the people want to have the presentation, they can actually send an email to marketing@headsprintexecutive.com, and we'll be sure to send them the presentation. However, after the call, you'll receive the recording of the webinar, so that will come straight to your inbox. So please feel free to share it with your teams, your colleagues. Yeah, it's better to share it. Adam, Bevan, thank you very much. This was actually very, very interesting. It was a very interesting dialogue. I'm sure the participants on the webinar enjoyed it as well. So no, really, I would like to thank you, Adam, and as well, Bevan, for joining us today. It was a great pleasure. Hopefully, we'll see you again soon. And I'd like to thank everyone that joined today. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. So we actually do this leadership series every 1 or 2 weeks. So please feel free to check our website to see what is the next leadership series webinar. We'll be able to communicate with you. So again, Adam, Bevan, thank you very much. I wish you a lovely day. And to all our participants, a lovely day as well. Please be safe. And